August 24, 410. The doors are open. For 800 years, since the Gauls under Brennus sacked the city in 390 BC, no foreign enemy had entered Rome. 8 centuries of walls, of legions, of the accumulated military and political machinery of the most powerful civilization the Western world had ever produced. 8 centuries during which the city had grown from a collection of hills above a river to the center of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The doors are open. Alaric did not ride in triumphant. The sources do not describe a conqueror's entrance. No white horse, no crowds forced to kneel, no speech from the steps of the capital. What the sources describe is an army moving through gates that had been unlocked from the inside, entering a city that had already resigned itself to what was coming. He had not wanted this. That is the thing that history, in turning him into a symbol, tends to forget. He had spent 14 years trying to avoid this moment. 14 years of negotiation, of patience, of sending terms that any rational empire would have accepted, of demonstrating over and over again that what he wanted was not destruction but recognition. Rome had given him destruction instead. Now he was going to give it back. For 6 days, the Visigoths were inside the city that had ruled the world. What they did, and what they didn't do, tells you more about Alaric than any battle ever could. This is the episode that history gets wrong every time it tells it. Subscribe, like the video, and let's get into what actually happened. Rome in 410 was not the Rome of Augustus. It was still enormous. 1 million people, the largest city in the Western world by a margin that no other city came close to matching. The Colosseum still stood. The Forum still functioned. The aqueducts still ran. The great basilicas of Constantine still dominated the skyline. By any measure available to the ancient world, Rome was the most impressive human construction on earth. It was also hollowing out. The aristocracy that remained was enormously wealthy, senatorial families whose estates in the Italian countryside generated incomes that dwarfed anything a provincial governor could accumulate in a career. Their city palaces were monuments to inherited wealth, filled with art and silver and the accumulated plunder of 5 centuries of imperial expansion. The poor were another matter. Rome's population depended on the grain dole, the imperial distribution of free grain that had kept the urban poor fed since the Republic. When Alaric's first siege cut the supply lines, the grain dole had stopped. 1 million people had begun to starve. By the time the second siege lifted and the roads reopened, the city had experienced what famine looks like at urban scale. The poor had eaten the animals first, then the leather, then, the sources record this with the kind of detail that suggests eyewitness testimony, each other. This was the city Alaric entered on August 24th, a city of extremes. Palaces and starvation existing within walking distance of each other. A population that had spent 2 years in varying degrees of siege, that had watched its leadership fail them at every opportunity, that had been told repeatedly that relief was coming and had repeatedly discovered that it was not. When the gates opened, many of Rome's own poor helped themselves to whatever the Gothic army left behind. The sack of Rome was not a simple story of barbarians destroying civilization. It was considerably more complicated than that. 6 days. The Gothic army was inside Rome for 6 days. In those 6 days, they did things that the sources record with precision because the precision mattered, to the people writing the sources, to the theological and political arguments they were making, to the world that needed to understand what had happened and why. They took gold. Enormous quantities of it, from the senatorial palaces, from the imperial storehouses, from the private collections of the wealthy families who had not managed to evacuate their valuables in time. The sources list specific objects: silver plate, silk, spices, jewelry, statues. The material wealth of 5 centuries of empire, concentrated in the palaces of the Roman aristocracy, was systematically removed. They took people. Hostages from the senatorial families, not for execution but for ransom, the standard military practice of the period. Among those taken was Galla Placidia, the sister of Emperor Honorius himself. The emperor's sister, taken from the Eternal City by a Gothic king who had spent 14 years asking that emperor for a title. They burned some buildings. The sources disagree on which ones and how many. Later Christian writers had theological reasons to minimize the destruction, while later secular writers had political reasons to maximize it. The archaeological record, which doesn't have an argument to make, suggests that the burning was real but limited. Specific structures, specific neighborhoods. Not the systematic incineration of a city. And they did not touch the churches. This is the detail that contemporaries found most significant and most confusing. Alaric had given explicit orders. The Christian churches were sanctuary. Anyone inside a church, Roman citizen, aristocrat, slave, foreigner, was not to be touched. The treasures inside the churches were not to be taken. The order was obeyed. St. Peter's Basilica became a refuge. Thousands of Romans, wealthy and poor, slave and free, crowded into the Christian churches and were left untouched by an army that was sacking everything around them. Alaric was an Arian Christian. He believed, in the theological framework of his people, in a version of Christianity that the Roman Church considered heretical. But he believed, and he had decided, in whatever calculation produced the order, that the churches were off limits. The pagan temples were not given the same protection. The Colosseum stood. The Pantheon stood. The Forum stood. The aqueducts, the engineering marvel that kept 1 million people supplied with water, were not touched. The Senate House stood. The great basilicas of Constantine stood. 6 days inside the largest city in the Western world, with an army of 40,000 warriors who had legitimate grievances going back 14 years, and the essential infrastructure of Roman civilization was intact when they left. This was not an accident. Alaric had grown up inside the Roman world. He had learned Latin. He had studied Roman military doctrine. He had spent his entire adult life trying to be recognized as part of the system he had been born adjacent to. The men in his army had served in Roman legions, had lived in Roman provinces, had children with Roman women. They were not the Huns, the force from the eastern steppes that had started this entire cascade of events, that genuinely had no connection to or interest in the civilization they were destroying. The Visigoths in 410 were something more complicated. They were people who wanted in, who had always wanted in, who had been told for as long as anyone could remember that in was not available to them. They took what they could carry. They left standing what they couldn't. And after 6 days Alaric gave the order to move south. Among the people who left Rome with Alaric's army was a young woman of approximately 20 years old. Galla Placidia was the daughter of Emperor Theodosius, the same Theodosius who had let the Visigoths cross the Danube, who had won at the Frigidus on the backs of Gothic dead, who had died in 395 and left the empire to his incompetent sons. She was the half-sister of Honorius, the emperor in Ravenna with his chickens. She was, in the formal hierarchy of the late Roman imperial family, one of the most important women in the Western world. She traveled south with the Gothic army. The sources are careful about how they describe her situation. She was a hostage technically, a bargaining chip in the negotiation that Alaric still intended to pursue with Ravenna. She was treated, by Gothic standards, with the respect due her rank. She was not harmed. What the sources also record, carefully and somewhat awkwardly, is that she eventually married a Gothic king. Not Alaric. Alaric died before that happened. His successor, a man named Ataulf, took Galla Placidia as his wife in a ceremony that mixed Roman and Gothic traditions, that was conducted in a Roman city in Gaul, and that produced a child they named Theodosius after her father. The child died in infancy. But the marriage happened. The daughter of Theodosius, the granddaughter of the dynasty that had built the Christian Roman Empire, married into the family of the Gothic king who had sacked Rome. The bloodlines of the empire and the people who had broken it merged in a ceremony in Gaul. History does not always move in straight lines. Alaric had a destination: Africa. The reasoning was strategic and had been for years. Africa, the provinces of North Africa centered on Carthage, was the grain supply of the Western Empire. Whoever controlled Africa controlled the food supply of Italy. Whoever controlled the food supply of Italy controlled, in any meaningful sense, the Western Empire itself. Stilicho had understood this. It was why the revolt of Gildo in Africa years earlier had been an existential crisis rather than a provincial inconvenience. It was why Honorius, even from Ravenna, maintained obsessive control over the African command. If Alaric could take Africa, he would have what he had never been able to achieve through military pressure on Italy: a permanent, unassailable position. Not a title on paper but actual, physical leverage that the empire could not ignore and could not outmaneuver. He marched south through Italy. The march was orderly. The Gothic army, now carrying the plunder of Rome, accompanied by thousands of Roman hostages, moving through a peninsula that had spent 2 years being systematically destabilized, moved south through Campania, past Naples, down the boot of Italy toward the Strait of Messina. The crossing to Sicily was 40 kilometers of open water, manageable for a determined force with sufficient ships. Alaric began assembling a fleet. The fleet was destroyed before it could sail. The sources are brief about this. A storm in the Strait of Messina, the ships broken up before the crossing could begin, the Gothic army stranded on the Italian shore watching the wreckage drift south. The Strait of Messina is one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the Mediterranean. The currents that gave rise to the myths of Scylla and Charybdis are real, and they are lethal to ships that are not built and crewed for them. Gothic warriors were not sailors. The fleet they had assembled was improvised, captured Roman vessels, fishing boats, whatever could be gathered along the southern Italian coast. It was not adequate for the Strait of Messina in bad weather. The storm ended the African plan. Alaric turned north. There was nothing else to do. Sicily was unreachable, Africa was unreachable, the strategic objective that had driven the entire southern march was gone. He began moving back up the Italian peninsula toward the north, toward Illyricum, toward the territory where his people could winter and where he could reassess. He did not get far. In the autumn of 410, somewhere near the city of Cosenza in Calabria, the toe of the Italian boot, Alaric fell ill. The sources say fever. They do not say what kind. Fever in southern Italy in autumn covered a range of possibilities, and the medical vocabulary of the period was not precise enough to distinguish between them. He died. He was approximately 40 years old. He had spent more than half his life in motion, fighting, negotiating, retreating, advancing, waiting. He had crossed the Alps twice. He had sacked Rome. He had taken the emperor's sister hostage. He had done everything that military force and political intelligence could accomplish, and he had died of a fever in a small city in the south of Italy, still without the title he had spent his entire life trying to obtain. His people buried him the way they had always buried their greatest kings. They found the Busento River, a small river that runs through Cosenza, and they diverted it. They dug a channel around the main flow, leaving the riverbed exposed, the mud and stones of the bottom, the accumulated sediment of centuries. Into that exposed bed they dug a grave. They laid Alaric in it. They put with him whatever the sources describe as his treasure. The accounts vary on what exactly went in, but the principle is clear. He was buried with wealth appropriate to a king who had sacked Rome. Gold, weapons, the objects that marked a man of his status. Then they covered the grave. They restored the river to its original course. The water of the Busento flowed back over the place where Alaric lay, erasing the surface evidence of the burial completely. And they killed everyone who had participated in the digging. Slaves, workers, anyone who had seen where the grave was, killed so that no one who knew the location could be made to reveal it. It was a brutal calculation, applied with the same cold logic that Alaric himself had always applied to problems that required permanent solutions. The grave has never been found. Archaeologists have been looking for it for centuries. Modern ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Busento riverbed and its surroundings have found nothing conclusive. The Italian government has funded searches. Independent researchers have proposed dozens of locations. None of them have produced Alaric. He is still there. Under the river, in the south of Italy, in a grave that his own people made certain no one would ever find. The king who spent his life trying to be recognized by Rome died unrecognized, in a town most Romans had never heard of, and was buried so completely that 2,000 years later we still cannot find him. Rome outlasted him by 66 years. It did not outlast what he started.